Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us today. We have a session planned for you today that is in addition to the twice-monthly webinars that we are doing for our MSCs and the transition to CCOs. This session today is on completing the forms. I want to remind you that sessions 1 through 9 are posted on the OPWDD website for your viewing. The link to that page is on the webinar screen. The next session a week from today will be enrollment and consent, the topic continuing with a focus on answering your questions, and we are receiving a number of those, and we're trying to be very responsive to all the questions that are raised. So today we'll go into more detail with two of our colleagues from OPWDD, Kate Bishop and Allison McCarthy from the Division of Person-Centered Supports. So Kate, why don't you go ahead.
Thank you, Diane, and good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start today with just a discussion of the resources available to you all. We've gone through these in different presentations, but just wanted to make sure you had a good understanding of the tools that will be available to assist, and which already are available in many instances, to assist with the transition from MSC to CCO. So the enrollment resources email sent to MSC providers was distributed on April 4th of 2018. And that included information and a specific documents, including the MSC toolkit, so the toolkit that you would use to help inform individuals and families making choices, the actual consent forms that will be used for both health home care management and basic plan of support, the health home checklist, and the SLMS enrollment instructions so that you can access and take the training relative to the enrollment activities underway that's part of that Module 1 SLMS training on enrollment. The information letters, just to give you a little update on that, the majority of individualized letters have been distributed to all MSC providers with the materials just referenced, and there are a few outstanding letters that will be sent by April 20, 2018. So if you're an MSC working for an agency that has yet to receive that packet, you can expect that that will be received within the next 2 days. The MSC info sessions that have been focused on enrollment include the April 11th enrollment and consent decision making, which really went through the specifics around who can be a decision maker on behalf of a person and how to document and what the process flow is for ensuring that those decisions are completed. April 18th, today, is really, as Diane mentioned, looking at completing the forms and things that are important to understand in the completion of the consent forms. And next week, on April 25th, we will be presenting about enrollment and consent again, trying to dig in a little bit more to some of the specific questions that have emerged as part of these info sessions that have been undertaken, and we want to be able to be responsive to the detailed questions that you've asked us in a way to help you facilitate those final steps. And in addition to the WebEx next week, we'll also be generating a frequently asked questions document for Medicaid service coordinators, and those also will bring the questions that you've been asking into one coordinated document that identifies them by the nature of the question to give you an additional resource for helping with this transition process. That document will be posted on the website, and it will also be mailed to the MSC provider agencies so that we are ensuring that you're getting access to that. The topic areas of greatest question were consent, and we know there's a lot of questions on that, which is why we're doing more here today, decision making, and some specifics around the MSC toolkit. So just to give a little overview, this is the second half of a training developed for Medicaid service coordinators on how to complete the consent forms for care coordination organizations, health home, CCO health home. The presentation will provide instructions for completing the consent forms. And those specific forms are the 5055 and 5200 and 5201. We'll be going through the details on that. There were also a lot of questions relative to how the MSCs, how you all should be communicating with individuals receiving services, their families, and decision makers. We recognize that some of these forms are not the typical forms that people are used to. They include some language that's not as familiar to individuals receiving services and their families. So we wanted to give you a little bit of a framework for how to discuss these specific forms and to help give you some guidance on how to proceed with those conversations. So it's important to make note to individuals and families that the forms are DOH forms and that they're available for use by all health homes, which include various different population groups. So there's health homes that serve people with mental health challenges. There's health homes that are specific to a more aged population. There are health homes that look at people who have substance abuse needs. So some of the forms, because they're all inclusive to any population group, will reference things that aren't familiar and aren't pertinent to people with IDD. So just to make sure that people understand that they're standardized forms, but that the elements, and we just gave in this slide an example such as reference to the psyche system, that's really something that's more pertinent to people who are served in the mental health system. So in that instance, it won't apply to the person. If they're not connected to that system, it won't be applicable. So just feel confident to be able to say that to individuals and families, that this is not applicable to the services that you're receiving in our system. It's also important to identify that the purpose of consent and its relationship to the use of the new IT systems that will support a life plan and better communication for people in our system is really to break down those silos that often exist between service providers, and the ultimate goal is to improve services. So people are familiar, and it's not unusual to document a consent to share information, because information is how we provide better supports. Having good, clear, accurate, and timely information is how services are improved. So it's important to make sure that that's the understood intent behind these consent forms. And one example of that you might want to use is that the RIOs, which are the Regional Health Information Organizations, which is an entity that's probably not that familiar to many individuals and decision makers, but the reason that those RIOs were implemented in the state of New York was to be able to share more timely health information for people who are engaged in the healthcare system. So having information about a hospital admission, for example, might be very important for the providers of services to know and the care manager to know, so that they can plan accordingly for things like a discharge from the hospital and getting needed supports in place. So those are just some examples to create a framework for why those consent forms are so important. MSC communication about information sharing. So the signed consent form will allow information sharing among the service providers identified by the individual or their decision maker. And that's really the critical reason, and again, the rationale for having these consent forms in place. You're agreeing to work with a particular CCO, and you are agreeing that information will be shared by the care manager who works in that CCO across the various supports that a person is engaged with. So what must be included on those consent forms is the person's medical provider and care manager, and as we typically do, people who are receiving services such as ResHab or DayHab or a SEMP service would list those providers as well, so that that information can be shared in a comprehensive way for people. So just give you a few general instructions. Give the individual give consideration to a person's level of understanding and comfort. So going through these consent forms, we don't want people to feel stressed by that process. So be attentive to somebody's comfort and their ability to pay attention for a long time during the course of completing the consent forms. Use the form in the language most suitable for the person. So if the form is not available in the individual's chosen language, you should ensure that there is a presence of an interpreter. That's also important for people who may need hearing or sign language interpreters. That's also an area where you need to participate in getting the right support giver to a person who has those special language needs. The DOH forms are currently being updated with the new DD language in various languages and will be available shortly on the DOH website. In the meanwhile, the forms that we send to you are the English version and will be as part of that MSC packet that I've already referenced. You want to complete all of the sections on the form as indicated, and Allison is going to walk through those specific areas of required completion. You want to review the completed form in full to make sure that they have an understanding prior to signing it, and you want to provide a copy of the completed form to the individual. You also want to maintain the original signed form in the individual's record, and that will ultimately need to be in the CCO's record. So as you complete those consent forms, those forms need to be shared with the CCO of choice by from the individual, and that's part of the overall education around the decision making and your direction on sharing pertinent information to the CCO once that CCO has been chosen and the consent has been signed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Allison McCarthy, who will go through some of the specifics on each of the relevant forms for the CCO enrollment.
Thanks, Kate. As Kate mentioned, we just want to provide some additional information on how to complete the various consent forms that have been shared with your MSC provider and ultimately provided to you so that you can sit down with individuals on your caseload to complete these forms. So the first form we're going to talk about is the DOH 5055. This is the Health Home Patient Information Sharing Consent Form for adults 18 years of age and older. So this form needs to be completed by adults who are 18 years of older, and by completing this form, an individual is agreeing that his or her health information can be shared among the consented health home partners and for the designated health home to access the Regional Health Information Organization. So Kate had mentioned the RIO, so you'll be providing permission for that information to be shared between the Care Coordination Organization and the RIO entity. Without consent, the health home care manager cannot share protected health information, so it's very important to complete this form in completion. So first we're going to talk about page 1 of 3 pages of the 5055. So you'll see here on this slide is the top of the 5055. In red, we have highlighted what information needs to be entered into these fields. So we have the name of the health home, so the name of the care coordination organization that the individual has selected is in the first line, and then we also have the same information, the name of the CCO or the health home, on the second line. This section of the consent form documents a person's agreement to enroll in the health home program and receive comprehensive care coordination. As you are well aware, the goal is to provide a robust person-centered care plan. So that is the top of page 1. Moving on, we will look at the center of page 1, which is also the 5055. Here we have the section that we actually enter in the name of the RIO. MSC providers have received a document that identifies for each CCO the affiliated RIO by county. So if you have not received this yet, we'll be sending in the coming days to your MSC provider, which basically gives you a resource tool to say, okay, if an individual lives in X county, they've selected X RIO, what is the, or they've selected X CCO, so Care Design New York CCO, you'll be able to actually identify and list the appropriate RIO for that individual. So it's not essential for the individual to know, but it's a resource for you to access to then enter in the RIO name into that consent form. Here on this slide, we just have a map of the RIO so that you can get a sense. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 RIOs available, and as I noted, we will be providing a resource to MSC providers to share with you so that you can identify which RIO to select and enter into the form. If a CCO is affiliated with more than one RIO, you can add both RIOs to the consent form. Moving on, we will look at the bottom of page 1. This section recognizes that information is stored in certain systems, similar to how an individual data is stored in the OPWD tab system. So at the bottom of page 1, you need to check the box that says, I agree to be in the CCO that I have selected, and it also includes the name of the RIO again. We've identified here the name of the individual needs to be printed, the signature of the individual or representative needs to be identified, and then the name of the representative needs to be printed. It also includes space for the individual's date of birth, today's date, and the relationship of the representative to the individual. So now we'll move to page 2 of the 5055. So it's a 3-page document, and we are talking about page 2. This details information about the individual and the consent process and how information is shared. For questions on page 2 that require entry, complete as follows. So for number 2 on that page, you may enter the CCO name and the contact number. For number 5, you can enter the care manager name or the CCO name. So if you are working with somebody and you will not be the care manager as the person transitions on July 1, you can just provide the CCO name. You do not need to specify the name of the care manager. And then you may include the name and the number of the CCO. For number 7, again, all you need to do is enter the CCO name. So once you know the CCO that an individual is selecting, you can actually pre-fill these fields. So for number 2, 5, and 7, which are the only fields that you need to enter on page 2 of the 5055, you can pre-fill that information. A list of CCO contact information will be provided to your MSC provider for you to use when completing this page. And lastly, we'll move to page 3 of the 5055. This section must list the following providers. So this is a listing of the providers for which an individual gives permission for information to be shared. The CCO name must be identified here, the primary care physician of the individual, and if applicable, the managed care organization. So that's only affecting a small portion of the individuals who we serve. But if they are enrolled in a mainstream managed care plan, the name of the managed care plan should be identified here. In addition to those required fields or required providers, we recommend that the primary IDD providers be identified, such as Article 16 clinics, Article 28 clinics, a residential habilitation provider, and a day habilitation provider. So that information, as Kate had mentioned, is already shared between providers that are delivering services to individuals in our system today. So it's not new, it's just basically saying that for someone who enrolls in a health home, it makes sense that the information continue to be shared and can be shared using the systems within the health home construct. For example, the Care Coordination Organization's IT system and the RIO IT system, information can be shared back and forth. Additional providers can be added at this time or at any time in the future if a person makes a decision to add a network provider to this list. Now we'll move to the children's forms. So for children under 18 years of age, we have a different form or 2 different forms to complete to enroll. So the first form is an enrollment form. So similar to the 5055, we're basically saying a person is making a choice to enroll, and therefore the 50, what do we have here? The 5200 is the form for selecting to enroll. And then we have a second form, which is to identify that information can be shared. So moving to the 5200, which is the consent to enroll for children 18 years of age and under. This form must be used to enroll children who are, again, less than 18 years of age. It must be signed by the children's parent, guardian, or legally authorized representative. And the health home consent information sharing for use with children under 18 years of age form, the 5201, must also be completed. So when you're completing the 5200, you also need to complete the 5201. So again, for the 5200, page 1, we are looking at the fields that the care manager or MSC needs to work with the individual to complete. We have the name of the CCO, the name of the individual's date of birth, and the name of the care manager. So if you may not be the long-term care manager, I would just enter in the MSC service coordinator's name there. Moving on to the next section of the 5200, page 1, we are looking at entering in, again, the name of the care manager. So in that situation, it's either you as the long-term care manager or the current MSC service coordinator. MSC should explain to the individual and child that the CCO health home of their choice is qualified to be a health home. MSCs must also review the health home FAQ developed by DOH to ensure individuals and families are fully educated and have all their questions answered. Moving to the next section of the 5200, we are looking at the name of the individual, entering the name of the individual, the name of the CCO, and then again, the individual's parent, guardian, or representative should be identified with their signature, and then the relationship to the individual and today's date. Now we'll move to the 5201, which is the consent form for sharing information. There are two sections of this form. This is a very important point because we are basically saying that section 1 should be completed by the child's parent and guardian or legally authorized representative, whereas section 2 is not necessarily completed at the time of this consent process. So section 2 can be completed later on, and I'll speak to that momentarily. This form must be used for children less than 18 years of age who have been enrolled in the health home. Again, section 1 is completed by the child's parent, guardian, or legally authorized representative. And again, section 2 should be completed separately during the person-centered planning process to develop the life plan. It is only completed if the individual is able to make independent health care and life decisions. This determination is made as a part of the person-centered planning process. So section 2 is really going to be completed by a very small number of people. We don't anticipate that this section of the form will be completed only on an exception basis for individuals who can make independent health care and life decisions.
Hi, this is Kate Bishop. I just want to add one piece relative to this section 2. For those of you who may not have looked closely at these forms, this section is a bit sensitive, and it's one of the areas where we've had a lot of questions from MSCs to date because it relates to discussions with the individual as a minor relative to some of their family planning needs, reproductive rights. So it's information that is not typical for kids served in our system. So we want you to, again, just go back to those earlier slides that I walked you through and think about this particular section, which is more pertinent in different population groups than it is in our system. So if someone's not able to make independent life decisions, as Allison said, this would not be needed to be completed for children who are being supported and served within our system. So it's just important to recognize that these forms are for a variety of groups of people of both children ages and adult ages, and it will be more pertinent to some groups of people, but less so in our world. And just to know that you have, as part of the normal planning process, to determine if someone is able to make independent decisions is only when you would need to complete this section. So just want to reiterate that point because I know there's a lot of concern in this area.
Thanks, Kate. And lastly, this is a review, but for the 5201 Section 1, which is the section we anticipate will be completed at the time of enrollment, we have the list of providers who can share the individual's health information. Again, these providers can share all information except for any information about services the individual consented for when they complete Section 2 of this form, which, again, as Kate mentioned, may not be the case for most individuals. We have the name of the CCO identified with the parent, guardian, representative initials, today's date, and then the listing of the providers that the individual has given permission for information to be shared. Again, for an individual, you must include the primary care provider and the managed care plan if applicable, as well as the CCO name. Additionally, we recommend the inclusion of primary DD providers for individuals, given the fact that information today is shared between those providers, and it can support the delivery of comprehensive care management for individuals who choose to enroll. So with that, we can turn to some questions. We have some additional time allotted for questions.
Okay, we have received quite a few questions, but let me one of the questions that has been asked a couple times is, what if MSC providers have not received their email, or if the email did not contain all of the attachments? There's been many, many questions about MSCs not having the consent forms. And
okay, so at this point there are less than 20 MSC agencies' emails that have not gone out. So by and large, the MSC agencies should have received these. If there is an issue, you can certainly send an email to the CCO implementation mailbox, which the MSC agencies have received other emails from. If there is an issue with believing you do not have all of the correct letters, then please send us that information so we can look for you.
Thank you. Another question was, what is a RIO exactly? Can you?
So a RIO is a Regional Health Information Organization, also known as a QE or Qualified Entity. These organizations have been established as a initiative by New York State to make data and information available between organizations that are working with individuals to support their health care and other developmental disability service needs. So it's basically an organization that's storing information, and what I think Kate had mentioned earlier, or maybe we missed that point, was that, for example, if an individual on your caseload goes to an ER overnight, that information is entered into the hospital's information, and if they are connected to the regional health organization, then an alert would be sent to the care coordination organization through their system that would say, this individual has went to the ER last night, and we want to make that information available to you so you can then know and understand that that individual's needs may need to be addressed differently that day. I don't know, Kate, if you wanted to add anything else.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. There's been the RIOs, the examples that I've heard from some of the other systems who've already been engaged in some ways with the RIO is, for example, if someone is serving a person with mental health needs, that person may go to 2 or 3 different hospitals seeking medication, for example. And again, this may not be as much of an issue in our system, but for those people, the care manager then would have access, and each hospital would have access to that information so that people aren't receiving duplicative medication prescriptions in the same area, or medications that contradict each other, or more prescriptions than they really should have. So those kinds of things. It's about information sharing and collecting that data, having consents in place so that information can be shared more readily to improve the system. I mean, it's important to make reference, and we keep saying it, but it's to improve communication and improve information sharing among the providers that the person is connected to.
Great, thank you very much. One of the other questions that we've been getting is, how long are the consents valid for?
The consents remain in place until there's a change in the person's desire for that consent. So you could consent, you could add additional providers, as Allison mentioned. You could remove certain providers or change a provider if you switched maybe service providers, like are now served by a different habilitation agency with Community Hab, say, for example. And if you wanted to change the enrollment in the particular CCO, you would go through a new consent process for the new CCO, or change your service level from health home care management to basic plan of support. You would need to complete the different enrollment form and the consents associated with that service type. So they would remain in place until a change occurs that requires a new consent form.
Thanks. And to piggyback on that, Kate, if a change happens, say a change in day hab providers or a change in provider, do they have to fill out a whole new consent form, or can they fill it out and initial on the existing consent form?
Yes, you would be able to update the consent form to add or remove various providers as your service providers change over time.
Okay, and I'm going to piggyback one more time. And on that consent form, are we listing just the name of the day hab provider, or are we getting into the details of the team, all of the team members, the people in the residence, or is it high level, the name of the day hab or the name of the residential provider?
You know, as we have displayed on slide 17, it's the name of the provider, and I believe the date, and if you're initialing it to add, you would initial it and add that date.
Great, thank you. Some people have a long list of providers. Is it acceptable to attach a separate sheet to the signed consent form listing all those providers, or must it be handwritten into each and every consent?
That's a great question. I would like to say that, yes, that would be acceptable. Let us go back and confirm and provide that as a final answer, but I would think that would be perfectly fine.
Can we add that to the MSC FAQ?
Sure thing.
Okay, thank you. And you might have answered this with the listing of the day hab and the res hab, but let me just clarify. Does the Article 16, do you need to list that somebody accesses Article 16, or do you need to provide the detail of Article 16, PT, OT, speech, and the details of that?
Just the name of the clinic is fine.
Thank you. Okay. There was a couple questions about the under 18 consent form, the 5201, and one of the questions was, due to some culture sensitivities, can Section 2 of the 5201 be completed at some later point in time, or can it be waived altogether due to some of these sensitivities?
So it definitely can and probably should really be completed at a later point in time as part of a person-centered planning process, because you're really making a determination about the person's ability to make their own independent decisions in some of those areas that are included in that form. We aren't able to waive that completely, but it should be applicable only in the situations that that really are relevant to those needs of the person from a planning process and the capabilities of the person related to their decision making.
Thank you. One of the questions says on page 3 of the 5055, it says, should any family, friends, or others an individual wishes to give consent to as well be listed here, or just for service and medical providers?
So that's a great question. I think it's important to note that when we talk about information sharing relative to this consent form, we are talking about information between providers, the RIO, the Care Coordination Organization, and it's a limited set of IT systems that can share information back and forth. When we talk about sharing your life plan or other information with organizations that are not formal providers, that becomes a part of the person-centered planning process and should be addressed with the individual's care manager at that time. So as you may be aware, each CCO has an individual portal that is available to individuals and members of their care team to access to share information that you want to be shared. And that permission is provided and accessible in the CCO's IT system. So I think it's important to differentiate when we're talking about the life plan and sharing information that's specific to the care plan. That would be happening with your care manager during the person-centered planning process and does not need to be addressed here in the consent form.
Great. Thank you. About the signatures, who's required to sign? If somebody has a legal guardian, or the legal guardian is required to sign? If they have an advocate, is the advocate required to sign? Can you just elaborate on that?
Sure. So that's a great question, too. And I refer you back to the decision-making training that occurred last week, where there's a specific listing of who the legal signers can be for consent. So you have 3 different groups. It's either the individual who's capable of signing and they can sign for themselves. They could have an identified decision maker as one of the parties identified in our recently issued emergency regulations, and there's a whole hierarchy there, and those decision makers defined in that hierarchy can sign. An advocate, just to make sure is clear, is not one of those entities. And then if there is no one in that decision-making group, the last approach to that decision-making would be a decision by either the residential director of a certified resident, if the person lives in a certified residential setting, the residential CEO, residential agency CEO, which would be the state-operated director if a person lives in a state-operated residence, and if the person does not live in a certified residential setting, then it would be the DDRO director in your locale. So really those are the groups of people who are able to sign the consent form, and you'll get more detail on that if you look back at that training for decision making that was completed last week and posted last Friday.
Thank you. What if an individual does not want their primary care physician to be listed?
They have to have, as far as the health home care management service, a medical provider needs to be listed. It's one of the requirements of the health home model. So they would need to list their primary care, or if they receive their services from Article 16 clinic, the Article 16 clinic, as Allison mentioned. And remember, the reason for that is not that to have the medical provider have every element of your HCBS waiver services, but it's to make sure that that silo between medical care and the person's overall plan of support through the OPWDD system are better coordinated, so that information sharing and input from health and wellness can be achieved. So in order to be compliant with the health home model, the inclusion of a health provider needs to be on that form.
Thank you, Kate. And then just two that I think I can clarify. There were some questions about the choices selection screen. If you're having any technical difficulties with completing the choices selection screen, on the OPWDD webpage, on the choices page, there is a list of choices liaisons at your regional office. Please contact them with any technical questions or difficulties you're having with processing that screen. Also, in regards to the original signed form, the consent forms, that form is part of the individual's record and will be one of the documents that will be required to be sent to the CCO that the individual has chosen. So that is what we mean by the individual's record. Another question came in about MSCs that are working with individuals that have chosen a CCO different than the one that the MSC is affiliating with. That MSC, you are responsible for completing the enrollment process for everybody on your caseload, regardless of which CCO the individual has chosen. You'll help them complete that process. And Megan, did you have any other questions?
So could you please re-explain where the consent forms are sent after they are completed and who maintains the original signed consent form?
Yes, the original signed consent form needs to be maintained by the CCO organization that the person has chosen. So they need to receive that original form, and we clarified, we can clarify again that what that means very specifically is the paper form signed, the original signature needs to go to the CCO. So it can't just be a scanned document to the CCO, it has to be the actual signed form in the file for the person's choice of CCO.
So just want to clarify there, so for each CCO, it may be a little different how they request to receive that information. For example, if you are an MSC today and you are transitioning to be a care manager for a CCO, you may be able to you should have the conversation with the CCO to determine what exactly and where that form should be signed. We've heard from CCOs in terms of that process and that policy for holding on to those consent forms may vary across CCO. So we are working with CCOs today to get additional information on that and ultimately provide guidance to MSC providers for each CCO and how they will be addressing that requirement.
When someone reaches 18 years old, will they have to then re-sign an adult consent form?
That's a good question.
It's a very good question. We will have to add that to our FAQ. I'm not sure.
Also, if during this consent process somebody turns 18 before 7/1, would they complete the children's consent or the adult consent form?
I would recommend the adult consent form.
When we list waiver providers on the list of providers on the consent forms, does that mean that the waiver providers will have access to the RIO or all of someone's health information?
No. So the CCO and the RIO can share information back and forth. That does not allow the provider to receive that information directly. Now it's up to the individual, again, to determine what information, in terms of the life plan and the person-centered planning process should be and can be shared with the downstream provider. But if you are listed on that form, the CCO has permission to verbally share information back and forth to inform you about the individual's status.
Yeah, I think a good example of that might be, again, with the idea of someone who's been to the hospital, would be that the communication through the RIO would be from the hospital to the care manager. The care manager could then share all the information with the service providers as appropriate for the services that they're delivering. So, you know, it creates a hub, and that hub is what's most important for alerts and communication sharing and information that's going to be most relevant to that person's plan of support.
I got a couple more that, so there was a couple more questions about the Section 2 of 5201, the under 18 form. The question is, who is responsible to make that determination whether or not an individual, a minor, is capable of making the decision, and how should that be documented and where?
That's a good question, and I think we can add a bit more to that on the FAQ. But generally, the course of your normal planning process for people, and whether the person is an adult or a child, kind of takes into account their ability to make independent decisions about a lot of areas in their life. Do they make choices about which specific program they want to participate in? Are they making choices relative to their own health care in other areas of their life? So those are the kinds of things that you discuss as part of the planning process for the life plan development. And if the person is not able to make those independent choices, you would document that as part of the life plan process, and it would just be a general part of the overall life plan, the profile section of the life plan, where you would be able to make that determination.
Thank you. Okay. When will the translated versions be available?
We anticipate having the translations towards the end of this week, so next week they will be shared. I did want to clarify that they will not be provided on the DOH website immediately, so we will be sending the translated consent forms to MSC providers for them to share them with you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, to go back to the 5201 Section 2. Can a parent decline to have their minor child complete this section, and if they do?
Well, the forms are required forms from DOH, so to determine that someone is declining to complete that form is not acceptable under the health home model. So, but it's important to recognize that we think the people who are really independent enough in our system to make the kinds of judgments and the planning that's necessary for some of these areas in question is going to be a small number. So the planning process itself, the determination about the person's ability to make these choices independently, and the relevance of the need for that sort of education in the person's life is going to be a small number. So I just caution not to get too concerned about what feels like a very different approach to planning in our system, and to think about really the small number of people that this will be applicable to, and make reasoned decisions about it. So I'm hoping that families are not so concerned about that phase 2 discussion that they will not participate in the benefits of the health home model, because we really think this is applicable to just a small number of people and should be considered through that lens.
Thank you. This question has come up several times about schools being included as a provider on the 5201.
So schools are not a required listed provider, and really the benefit, as Allison described, from all of the information sharing really would not be something that would be beneficial by having the school on that list. The school will be able to be identified as part of the life planning process, for who can receive certain information in the overarching support plan for the person, but the sharing of that medical information and the RIO utilization and the connecting to the care management wouldn't really have a benefit to the school program, so we wouldn't see them as needing to be a part of that list.
Thank you. And Leslie, can you just confirm, was the checklist sent as part of the email to all MSC provider agencies?
On April 4th.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
I will double check as we're sitting here, though.
And the checklist is part of the toolkit.
Yes, it was.
And it is also part of the toolkit and one of the resources that's in the SLMS system.
It is, yeah. The checklist is not on the OPWDD website as part of the MSC toolkit, but it will be part of the resources section of the SLMS training.
Thank you, Ange.
Along the lines of including providers on the consent, should the local Department of Social Services agencies be included?
I don't believe so. We can address in the FAQ, but it's really a listing of providers that are caring for the individual, and it's not the local county now.
Another question that keeps coming up is on the consent for the provider section. Do they need to include the name of the CCO the individual has chosen to receive the information as well? And also people are being directed to include parents and guardians here. Can you just clarify that?
So the name of the CCO needs to be included because that is basically giving the CCO permission to share information between the RIO and its own IT system. There is not a need to include the guardian or parent. Again, if an individual chooses to share information that is contained in the CCO's care coordinate system or life plan system, then they can do that and determine that permission through the person-centered planning process at the time that they sit down with their care manager to develop that life plan.
Great, thank you. Just trying to go through and make sure that we're answering. Okay. There will be a MSC information session on the checklist coming up, correct?
So next week's information sharing will be piggybacking on some of this information and providing additional clarification regarding many of the questions that have been communicated here today. In terms of the checklist, I look to Diane to confirm or...
We certainly can do that, yeah.
Yes.
I think, and perhaps we should do it right after the first, we should do the first one in May on the checklist, perhaps. So yeah, we can definitely plan for that.
Great, thank you, Diane. And we will announce that through the MSC advisory, so if you're not signed up, please do. A question here to clarify that the DOH 5200 and the DOH 5201 Section 1 need to be completed for children under 18 years old during the transition period.
Correct.
Thank you.
Section 2 can be held until the person-centered planning process, and as we mentioned, we don't anticipate it'll be relevant to most individuals in our service system today.
Do the consent forms that we reviewed today also apply to the basic HCBS plan support?
Good question. No, it does not. A separate consent form for basic plan support was shared with MSC providers on the 4th of April, and that form should be used for individuals selecting that service.
Are the signed consent forms being uploaded into the supporting docs of choices?
So there isn't a requirement for that at this point in time. The CCOs will each be giving instruction on how they will obtain documents, but there is nothing that prevents that. So if an MSC feels they would like to put that information into choices, it will be available in the person's new record after they move into a CCO on July 1st, so it's really optional at this point.
There is a question about, you know, where it's noted what CCO the individual has chosen, and I guess I can answer this. When the individual completes the consent form, you are filling out the name of the CCO that the individual has chosen, and that's where, and the only form that it will document that name of the CCO that the individual has chosen. There is no other forms, there's no separate forms. It's the consent form that.
Right, and just to piggyback on what Angie just said, once that consent form is signed and you know who was chosen, you'll complete the screen in choices, the choices system that will identify the choice of CCO and the choice of service level. So, so that's what you'll complete after that consent form is signed.
When do these consent forms need to be completed by?
So we are encouraging Medicaid service coordinators to meet with individuals to discuss the health home program and their option to enroll in the CCO as soon as possible. Obviously, we want to make sure you guys have all the answers you need, so, you know, think about what that timing is, but obviously we have between now and July 1st to effectuate the decision for everyone on your caseload. So, you know, we're looking to, you know, get those decisions in place as soon as possible. We're recommending by June 1st, but individuals will be able to enroll up till July 1st. June 30th, I should say. June 30th, you must be entered into the choices system.
Right. And just to add one other thing to that, think about the people on your caseload and who needs those outside decision makers, because it's, you know, it's going to be easier to get the decisions completed for adults who have the capability to decide on their own behalf, and where there's decision makers available in the person's life, you know, that can be fairly readily, confidently pursued. But where you know that you may have difficulties getting information back from people who are decision makers, or where you know the person does not have a decision maker, try to get those people identified as quickly as possible, put the information packet together so that you can reach out to those other decision makers and get a documented consent form completed and be able to make that choices selection in the system. So with that, we are wrapping up, and we thank you for all your great questions, and hopefully this information was helpful, and we'll be talking to you again next week. So thanks for your hard work out there, everybody, and keep reaching out with questions so that we can keep helping through this transition process. Thank you very much.